see all of you. Before we get into introducing our guest today, I do want to introduce, we've got some people from the community here that I just would like to stand up so that when we break at midpoint, FedUp Foods team, you can introduce yourself to our guest today. So Clark Duncan and his team from the Chamber are here. Michael Welcher from Big Pat Capital. We have Vivian Bolanos from Dogma Trust and First Citizens Bank. Very good. Am I missing anybody else here? You? Yes? Yes.
I'm Susan Applin, and I'm the CEO of Pure Pay.
Okay.
All Kitty Butler brands.
Thank you for joining us today. Yeah, thank you very much. And I also want to give a special acknowledgement today. Janet, would you stand up? Janet is a new friend of mine. I was kindly introduced to her by Rusty from First Bank and Scott Crawford at First Bank, and her and I really connected just in regards to our paths and journeys and leading people, and she was so kind and gracious to offer this for our program. So on behalf of FedUp Foods, Janet, we really appreciate this opportunity to involve our team in this community platform. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And on behalf of Chancellor Van Dorn and our whole Bulldog team over here, we're so glad that all of you are here. And actually, I have one of my very best student athletes here, my serious. So thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. And for our guests, at FedUp Foods, every year as part of our learning and development, we pick out a book that we read as managers and leaders. And this year we're reading a book by Professor Dweck called Mindset. And Professor Dweck suggests in her research that individuals' abilities to grow intellectually can happen if we lean into challenges and persist through setbacks. And if we do that, that's when we develop a growth mindset, which leads to greater success academically, career-wise, and then most importantly in our personal relationships. And as I've been thinking about today's visit, I was really remembered of a moment in time where I had some significant growth. And it was a point where I was coaching varsity basketball, and a young man named Jelani Johnson knew I was going through a lot and presented a song to me. And the song is called Sky's the Limit, and it's by the Notorious B.I.G. And Biggie is an amazing individual who had a lot of adversity and grew from nothing to a significant writer, collaborator. And in that song, Sky's the Limit, there's a verse that really embodies the growth mindset, and it says, stay from being timid, only move if your heart's in it, and remember the phrase, sky's the limit. And what Biggie's urging his listeners is to have this bold and fearlessness to go after your own views of your limitations as an individual. And our next speaker definitely is fearless in his pursuit for growth. His passion in research around social impact has led him to be a very sought-after global speaker and best-selling author, where he focuses on bringing communities together to really solve for issues around social justice with the environment, but also showing the ways that they can grow by aligning their values with their customers. And let me give you a little background on Simon. Simon is a brand futurist, global keynote speaker, columnist, podcaster, and best-selling author. He is the founder and CEO of We First. It's a strategic consultancy accelerating the growth and impact of future-facing, purpose-driven brands and B Corp's Best of World honoree. Some of the companies that Simon worked with are Nike, Toyota, United Nations, Medalist, Moderna, the list goes on. Simon's first book, We First, is a New York Times bestseller and named Best Marketing Book of the Year by Strategy+Business. His new book, Lead With Me, is a Wall Street Journal bestseller, #2 Forbes Best Business Book of the Year, McKinsey's top business bestseller on workplace and culture, and AXIOM gold medalist for leadership category. It's an official nominee for the next big thing and a finalist for the International Business Book of the Year. Personally, Simon is a Thinker 360 top global thought leader, influencer on climate change, Momentum Top 100 Impact CEOs in the US, host a very influential podcast, Lead with We, a prolific columnist for Forbes and the CMO Network. He is ranked among Real Leaders Magazine's top 50 keynote speakers in the world, and recently was a jury member for the Cannes Lions Festival on Sustainability Development Goals and US One Show on Sustainable Development. Simon has a wife and 2 children. Would you all please welcome Simon Mainwaring.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Hi.
As we kind of been talking through all of our leadership series, the really important piece about this is the journey of the leader. And Simon, I'm really excited to start tapping into your journey and sharing a little bit how you got to where you're at. And I'm sure there's a lot of stories with surfboards and sharks coming from Australia. But yeah, I really would like to start there with you, and it's just tell a little bit about your background and how you landed into this position.
Firstly, thanks for the chance to just share some thinking and my story with you. I really appreciate everyone's time. And please ask those curly questions today. Ask the things that you think about afterwards and go, God, I wish I'd asked that, or whatever. Really take whatever value you can from this time together. My journey began, I'm Australian, which is why I sound the way I do. I did fine arts and law at university and came out of that and had no idea what I wanted to do. None whatsoever, had no sense of self-possession or self-assuredness at that age. And so I had a conversation with someone and they said, wow, you have a really inappropriate sense of humor. Maybe you should get into advertising. And I thought, okay, what is that? And they said, a copywriter. And I had studied law, so I thought that meant trademarks. And it turned out to be something very different. So I started my career in Australia at agencies like DDB and Saatchi and had some early success. So I went to London and worked at Saatchi in Legas, Delaney and Charlotte Street, which is kind of the place to be for advertising when the UK was the place that was leading the advertising world globally, and worked in Adidas, BBC, Harrods, and so on. And I did a bunch of well-recognized work on Adidas, so I got headhunted to go and work on Nike over at their ad agency in Portland called Wieden & Kennedy. And I didn't even know where Portland was. I thought Portland was on the East Coast when I got offered the job. I didn't even know Portland existed on the West Coast, true story. And I landed in this rainy city and I was like, oh my God, my wife's gonna kill me, we're Australian, where's the sun? Anyway, I spent 5 years as a writer on Nike. There's 5 of us, and you have a writer and an art director. And for every project, all 5 teams are pitted against each other. And on every project, you swap out with a different art director. So when you're doing the Olympics or the World Cup, for 9 months, you're all writing campaigns that are going to be shown globally, and you go and present them, and everyone competes with each other and then tries to knock each other off, and then the next project, and you're trying to knock each other off with a different constitution of the same people. It's quite an environment to be in. It's quite competitive, as you can imagine. Had some success there in terms of those shiny statues and things that you think will make you happy, that you think fulfill that void inside of you, whatever that caused that void in the first place. But after 5 years of reign in London and 5 years of reign in Portland, my wife said, I'm going to LA, feel free to join me, because we have young children. And I said, I'm going to follow her. So I took a job as worldwide creative director for Motorola. So I ran their business globally. We launched the Razr phone, which was quite a big deal back in the day. And I think I'm old because it's coming back now. So that's how old you are. There's something, anyway. But net, the Nike experience and the Motorola experience gave me a visceral experience in how to lead cultural movements. You launch a shoe and 100 million people buy it. You do the Olympics or World Cup and people follow, the interests that you direct them to. And at the end of all of that, with that skill set, I thought, right, I'm going freelance. And so I spent 6 years as a kind of like the cleaner from Pulp Fiction. I'd be the last guy you'd call at the last minute when an agency is gonna lose an account or a brand was going under. And I did this breathless brand triage for 6 years with Fortune 500 companies where you'd rappel in for 4 days or 3 weeks or 3 months and then 4 days. to just troubleshoot. And at the end of that, I kind of really stress tested all those areas of insecurity that I had to try and work at the best places in the UK and Europe and try to work in the best places in the States. And I was feeling unchallenged. Quite honestly, I was at a loss because you'd done a lot of the things that you thought would fulfill that void inside of you, but I still had this nagging void. And then something happened that really changed the course of my life. I was a freelancer and I walked into my kitchen in LA and there was the answering machine on the counter, which shows you again how old I am. And there was 5 messages. And the first one was from my mum, and she's yelling down the phone, "Simon, pick up the phone, Simon, pick up the phone." Because she's trying to call from the answering machine in the kitchen to me asleep in bed on the other side of the house, because of the time difference between Sydney and LA. Next message, mum yelling down the phone, "Simon, pick up the phone, pick up the phone." Next message, my sister, Simon, like yelling down the phone, "Please pick up the phone." My next message, 4th message, my mum saying, "Simon, wake up, please pick up the phone." And then finally the last message, and it was my mum who just said very quietly, "Simon, Dad died. He was calling to say goodbye. Call us when you wake up." And I hadn't seen my dad for 5 years because I've been running around being a fancy pants ad guy. And those words, "wake up," took on a profundity for me that I didn't think she even intended. Like, wake up from what the hell you're doing. Like, what are you doing? And for the first time in my life, I got out of my own way. I was so destabilized personally because I felt very kind of, not guilty, but unsure of what to do with the situation because there's nothing I could do about it now that it passed. And also I was feeling unchallenged professionally. And instead of retreating to my head and writing lists and what am I going to do, I just sat in that uncertainty, which I'd never done before because it's uncomfortable, right? To sit in the not knowing. And that went on for about 3 weeks. And I was sitting in the garage and I happened to see and read the speech that Bill Gates gave at the World Economic Forum that year at the end of 2007 and then at the UN General Assembly in 2008. And it was called his creative capitalism speech. And he said the private sector needs to play a bigger role in social change because we're in trouble and it's getting worse. I don't know if anyone remembers that. Young people probably wouldn't remember that. It was kind of an NPR thing at the time. And I took that very much to heart and I thought, wow, this is a brief. He even called it creative capitalism, like a creative brief. And so I spent 3 years writing this book, We First, the first book that I wrote, to try and answer that, and that did well, as Dave kindly mentioned. And now for the last 15 years, I've been working with these companies, with my team, to help them think through the strategy, culture building, and storytelling to execute against the purposeful role they want to play in the world. So there was no strategy behind all of this. It only happened by accident. I'd done all the things that people might have looked at and thought, oh, that made you a success, or that must make you feel whole. And yet I was left feeling very, very empty. And the universe came along and slapped me on the side of the head with the passing of my dad and set me off in a new trajectory. And I think in hindsight, I was looking for meaning in the work that I was doing. I didn't just want to sell sheet metal or sell sneakers anymore. I wanted there to be some sort of purpose in my life. And now for the last 15 years, I've never questioned what I do. I struggle with what I do and doing it well or not, but I don't question what I do, and that's been a huge relief.
I can relate to the story with your father because I had a similar situation with my mother who was diagnosed with cancer, which, you know, I was actually playing collegiate sports and then I stopped playing because I got depressed and it just wasn't operating. And then when I was at home, my mother was like, you know, you need to get on with your life. And she knew she was terminal. And I had a similar situation where my mother, actually the woman who was taking care of her, the nurse at night, was calling because she had been in a coma the last couple of weeks, and she came out and said, I wanted to speak to David. And she had like a few words, which was basically, do you want to come home? And it was a symbol for me to come home. Lost my mother, but similar to what you were saying, that challenging moment was an opportunity for you to really focus and look at yourself and then pivot and figure out how you could take that moment to do something much more meaningful.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I see it as a gift and probably a huge gift from my father, and there's a couple of thoughts I'd share. Firstly, who here in this room is still struggling, with all honesty and transparency, and don't look at anybody else, with articulating and defining for yourself what that core purpose is for your life? Raise your hand. Okay, so a bunch of people. And who here has gone through some sort of traumatic event like David and I that has shifted the course of their life at some point? Right? So it's common to the human experience. I'll share one other thing that I don't usually share, which is, there's lots of things we don't understand in terms of what drives our life. And after I got off those phone calls with the answering machine, I walked and sat down on my bed with my wife, and she could see something was wrong, and I was sitting on the edge of the bed. She sat up, and I just said, Dad died, and he'd been sick for 17 years, so been a long time coming. And my younger daughter walked in, Talia, and she was still in diapers with a t-shirt, and just, she could communicate and talk. And she could see I was upset. And she said, "What's wrong?" And I said, I was really present to what had just happened. I really wasn't in any mood to have any conversation. And I said to her, Grandpa died. I'm probably going to have to go to Australia to say goodbye to Grandpa, but you can stay here with Mum and da-da. And she said, "No, I want to come." And I said, "No, there's just going to be a lot of old boring people and very serious. Probably won't be any fun. And, so you stay here." And because I really wasn't dealing with the situation well. And she said, "No, I want to say goodbye. I want to say goodbye." And I said, "Oh, okay, come here." And I sat on the edge of the bed, and she came over, and I put my arms around her, and I said, "Grandpa, we love you very much. We're glad you're out of pain, and we're so happy that you now you are free, and we want to say a big goodbye, so we can give you a big hug." And I gave my daughter a big hug like this. And I was holding her, and I let go, and I said, did you feel it? Did you say goodbye to Grandpa?" And she said, I did. I could hear him. And I said, what do you mean? And she stepped back. I said, well, what did he say? And she looked up at me at like, I don't know, 3 or 4 years of age, looked up at me, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "I love you, Simon." And she'd never called me Simon in her entire life. I was Dad, I was Daddy, I was whatever. To this day, do not understand that in any way whatsoever. But so these moments come along in our lives, some of which indicate that there's logic to it and determination, and some of them are sort of inexplicable depending on your belief system and so on. But I think the journey that we're talking about is really about finding alignment between who you are and what you do on a daily basis, and finding that integrity of action by being authentic to your true self. And I think that's really, really hard to find, especially with all the distraction and all the messaging and the projection we get as to what success should look like today. And I think probably the most important journey any of us can make is not the exterior one to validate yourself in the eyes of others, but it is that interior journey to work out what is true to you, and for you to have the courage to let everything else fall away and allow that to show up, because that's where your true value and power is.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot about conformity and in regards to how that is a disservice to finding our individuality and how we have shaped, specifically this country, how we're supposed to be. And we're losing the innovation of our individual self-worth by conforming versus having the strength, as I said earlier, about facing that belief that we're limitless versus the capacity to grow. Fascinating. So fast forward, here you are working with all these organizations, and you're seeing firsthand some of the biggest companies wrestle with what's next. How do we take this period in time where, depending on how you look at things, I personally view that we're in a very cyclical pattern that we've seen in the post-industrial revolution, that we've seen in the 60s and 70s, but we've got now this whole nother layer, as you mentioned, around technology, businesses, people, culture. Where do you see what's next?
Yeah, it's so complicated, but a few different things I'd point to is, for years now, having written a book about social media in the early days, we've been outsourcing ourselves, decolonizing ourselves into these different avatars of ourselves across one platform, Facebook, and now myriad platforms, Instagram, TikTok, and so on. And so our experience of ourselves and others' experience of us is now very fractured across all these different expressions of ourselves, which is very confusing for ourselves and everybody else. And AI is compounding that even more. And Dave and I were talking last night, and I think while it's cyclical, I think it's harder today to be self-determined because the amount of information and expectation that's implied by that information coming at us is more than ever before. And the density of it, it's almost impenetrable from the moment we wake up on our phones to this sort of algorithmically, intensified addiction we have to checking our phones every 5 minutes. It's consuming our entire sense of being in the world. And I think that's really, really, really challenging if, in truth, you want to kind of get very clear-eyed about who you are and what your unique gift is to give. And so, with that as context, I think this moment in time is unique for another couple of reasons. I think leadership at a brand level, and we're lucky enough to be with the SLTs and ELTs of many industry-leading global companies, and you kind of get to see under the hood and the challenges of what they're facing. And everyone is struggling in different ways. Leadership is going to be defined by your ability to manage through multiple crises at once. If you just look at the last few years, we've had COVID, global supply chain disruption, Ukraine, Gaza, and so on and so on. Every one of those destabilizes, at the very least, our mindsets on a daily basis, our sense of happiness and how we show up in the world. But in very literal terms, your ability to ship your product around the world or God knows what. Secondly, I think the past has less to do with the future than ever. Why? Because the half-life of technology is shrinking. If you look at the CPU computing power of companies like NVIDIA and so on, and what that empowers them to do through AI, everything's changing so quickly. Younger demographics are coming through. And meanwhile, you've got these concurrent global crises, from ocean acidification to loss of biodiversity to the climate crisis and so on, all of which are connected, and they're not sitting there statically out there in the future waiting for us to arrive. They're compounding as we speak and hurtling back towards us in the present. And if you looked at the recent CEO speech presentation by the CEO of NVIDIA last week, or 2 weeks ago, they are creating a computer-generated replica of the Earth using all the information they can gather through around the globe and working with the Weather Channel to predict where extreme weather is going to come next because of all the destabilization that's going on. And so all of that is to say that we've got to back out of the future rather than build on the past, because the future is changing so quickly. So as you at a company, or as you as an individual who's innovating on behalf of your company, or you as an individual who wants to grow and be relevant to the marketplace, you're far better served by looking, what's your industry or your company going to look like in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, and reverse engineer from that and create milestones on the way. And then what you'll discover is that those projections you had 5 years out are here in 18 months. But by positioning yourself that way, the market will rise to meet you rather than you being caught flat-footed because you're incrementally iterating or innovating on the strength of what got you marginal increase the year before. Does that make sense? And if you don't have that mindset, you are going to be left behind. The good news is that all of these challenges are marketplace opportunities in disguise. So solving for the climate crisis, restoring biodiversity, turning carbon and many other problems that we have into physical products that people can use in ways that are responsible to the planet. These are all opportunities, and a company's going to step into them, and they're going to be the new leaders of tomorrow because the need is so great and the urgency is so great. So the way that we look at it and the way that we encourage companies to deal with these situations, because all these leaders are struggling to know where the hell to go and what's the right way and what's the right steps to take, is to recognize the opportunity inherent in these problems and to really mobilize their teams to solve for it. So, if you can really honor yourself despite all the noise, and you can reverse engineer out of the future and see these marketplace challenges as opportunities, then the future is very, very bright.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, that whole re-engineering backwards, and we got several bankers here. That's a pretty interesting financial model. Where you're really focused on building ROIs on very much input that is probable versus working backwards there's a lot of uncertainty. And can you talk a little bit about, because you've already addressed that we live in these uncertain times, but that re-engineering and the uncertainty factor.
There's a couple of examples and also just some thinking around it. Whether we like it or not, every company, banking or otherwise, has got to be on the right side of history, given the challenges we face. There's no way we can hide from the climate crisis or any of these issues that you read about every day. It doesn't matter who you are, how much money you have, what position you have, you can't hide. And what's happening if you look at, for example, CSRD, which is the climate regulations in Europe, or you look at the new SEC regulations around climate disclosure, or if you look at the new EU ecocide legislation that's coming through that's holding companies criminally liable for willfully damaging the environment, or if you look at lawsuits for greenwashing like against KLM and so on. It doesn't matter what any of us think, in the business world, we're being frog marched further and further into greater accountability for how we're showing up. Why? Because it's hurting our supply chains. Why? Because you can't attract the talent you need. Why? Because younger demos grew up wanting this, whether you're an employee or consumer, because they see that their future has been forfeited and they're saying enough. We want to work for, buy from, or support companies that are doing good. The market forces are driving it. So we can talk about ESG and sustainability all day long. But the truth is, if you pull back and look at it telescopically, and I've been lucky enough to see it for 15 years, everyone's sort of screaming and shouting and gnashing their teeth on the way, but we're moving in the right direction. With that in mind, banking companies are doing interesting things like Santander, which is a company out of Europe, working with Tesco and other companies to provide preferential financial terms when they're lending for companies that are more sustainable. So on behalf of the capital they're lending, they're incentivizing companies to show up in more responsible ways. And the good news is the banking sector or financial sector more broadly is always responding to the investor class in some way, because that's where the money is. And for the first time in 15 years that I've seen, you've got employees, you've got suppliers, you've got leaders, you've got consumers, you've got customers or retailers, but finally you've got investors at the table. And they can argue about ESG or otherwise, but no one's minimizing their commitments. Everyone's still moving forward. And when you've got all of those stakeholders at the table, you actually have a viable alternative engine for capitalism. Because up till now, we didn't offer a viable alternative because all the pieces of the engine weren't in place. You didn't have the money at the table. But now that the money is at the table, all those other stakeholders are in place and that engine can start to work. And to give an example as to whether it's working or not, because this can all sound like wishful thinking or God knows what. Clean energy. Look at the shift towards clean energy. Clean energy has just taken over oil and gas globally. If you look at clean beauty and all these companies falling over themselves as to what the ingredients are. If you look at clean food and you go into the shopping aisle and everyone's screaming about whatever they're, look at clean apparel. It's not just the Patagonias of the world now, but everyone's talking about how supply chain and how they source things and everything. All of these major industries. If you think about it, in 2011 when my first book came out, Tesla had just launched and everyone was trying to run Tesla out of town. They were literally, and it's all documented, very aggressive tactics were used to really shut down that technology. And here we are, just over 10 years later, and every major US automaker has committed to transition away from combustion engines by 2030. Every single one. That's a major shift because the auto industry is kind of the blood life of America in a lot of ways, and Detroit and so on. So all of that is to say is that I think the financial sector, I think banking will increasingly be rewarded on behalf of their customers and their own brands and businesses for being on the right side of history, which is to incentivize the innovations and technologies and behaviors that actually course correct our future rather than drag us back into the past.
Yeah, I think for us here at FedUp Foods, listening to you talk about, those inputs around making impactful decisions. I know we've got some team members here that are very much leading those efforts as we're continuing to make decisions about how we buy, where we buy, and the impacts of those decisions. Is really leading us to be much more competitive in a marketplace that is shifting from brand loyalty now to just quality and service and what is it doing for the environment. What can you share with us in regards to that as it relates to what you're seeing at the brand level as well as what's shifting in the manufacturing space?
Yeah, I mean, it's been everyone sort of looks at a moment in time as definitive without recognizing that it's just one step on a much longer story arc. When I started in this space in 2008, everyone's like, should we be sustainable? And then it became, how can we be sustainable? And then it's like, well, who's the most sustainable? And so on and so on. The conversation matures. So what I'm seeing now at a brand level is, now that companies are being regulated, even here in the US, to make climate disclosures, to show up with greater accountability, the question then becomes, if we're making those time, capital, resource investments upstream in our supply chain or downstream with our consumers, how do we capture the value of that, the business value for doing so? In which case, they're like, oh, we've got to tell people how to do it. Because up to that point, everyone's been arguing about whether they should do it or not. So what we're seeing now is a big sort of push towards head scratching around how do we communicate this to our employees so we attract and keep the talent we need, to the street, because increasingly investors are looking for that sort of assurance in the narrative that a company is putting forward, whether they're doing an IPO or whether they're doing their quarterly reporting or whatever it might be. And you're starting to see a rising expectation that companies need to be articulate and defensible in what they're saying. So there's a huge pushback against greenwashing. And there's these two pillars, there's greenwashing on one hand and anti-woke kind of concerns on the other, and politicking. And in the context of that debate, you've got to be really clear about the meaning of the words versus the politicking through the media. These footballs are being kicked around the terms and so on, and different states are penalizing companies that have ESG commitments and so on. But if you look behind the hood, two things are happening. You're seeing that if you look at Deloitte, PwC, and all their research, all the companies are still as committed to sustainability as ever. And if you look at Nielsen, IQ, and McKinsey's report that came out in February, consumers, for the first time that I can recall, are actually not just seeing sustainability as an insurance policy, like I buy what I want because I want it, and oh, it's nice that it's sustainable, but it's actually driving purchasing preference. Why? Because they look at their phones every day and the sky's falling in. Why? Because there's extreme weather everywhere. Why? Because something's up and they just feel it in their bones that they've got to play a role. And most importantly, what companies at a brand level don't realize is it's not about a brand telling people about the good that they're doing, their net zero plan or whatever it might be. It's about positioning their brand as a platform through which consumers and customers can activate their own agency for change. So in our work, we explain it by saying you need to be the celebrant rather than celebrity of your stakeholder community. So the big mistake you see brands who do amazing work, well-intended, with precious capital, as they go, here's all the stuff we're doing, look at what we're doing. And everyone goes, great, but you're still talking about yourself. As opposed to a brand that says, we're a platform, and look at what our employees are doing. Look at what our retail partners are doing. Look at what consumers are doing. And people pay attention to that because it's about them. Because it's celebrating their role. Because it's allowing them to feel, by buying your product, they're exercising their own agency for change. So they feel like they're part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Because I'm not just some brand guy. I'm a dad with a 24 and a 21-year-old daughter. And I'm sure as hell worried about their future. And when I now look at what we have in our cupboard, or I go shopping with my wife, I kind of look at it and go, is that a smart choice or is that an irresponsible choice? Has that got a lot of packaging on it or has it not? Is that claim legit or is this just a lot of noise and greenwashing? Who feels that way when they shop? Is anyone here? Right? You're more conscious about what the hell you're buying now? So all of that is to say that at a brand level, we're at that moment in time where how you tell that story of the work you're doing is really coming to the fore, which is why we're finding our work is really important, because for the last 10 years, everyone's like, we're not even sure if we're going to do it. So we're not even worried about telling anybody about it. Now it's like, oh crap, we've got to spend the money on it. How are we going to capture the business value and therefore tell the story? And I think brands are really struggling how not to be boring, not to be preachy, not to be punitive because you're doing something wrong because you're buying this product with plastic on it, and they're desperately trying to go, well, we just advertised before and sold the sizzle of the steak, and now we've got to talk about substantive issues and we don't know how to do that. And most of the ad agencies, ex-ad guy, whatever, most of the ad agencies don't know how to do that. And they don't know how to do it because they don't care. And I say that with love, but there's been a lot of optics and image management and outside-in thinking, and what is needed is pure passion for this work and a deep understanding of the consequences and an inside-out approach. So that's kind of where we are in this longer narrative.
Yeah, just thinking about where we're at as an organization, and you find FedUp Foods at a very, very momentous moment in our history due to what's happening with our clients, and they are shifting away from the brands to really focusing on their own assets, which is the real estate, the shelves. They've listened to the consumers, but they've also have been exhausted dealing with the brands and the way that the brands have leveraged that relationship over the decades. It gives me great confidence in where we're going as an organization and the way that we're going to be able to help some of the leading retailers innovate around their private label programs, which historically, at least in the States, were just an afterthought when people would go to the store and would purchase stuff. Like when I was growing up, it was a black and white package, going to A&P and getting that, and then eventually a little bit of imagery that would maybe do a mock-up to like a macaroni cheese that would compare to Kraft. But today, you're seeing the retailers present in a way that's like, we don't want to follow anymore the brands. We want to be leaders and innovators, and those are the conversations that I feel very privileged that we're having and that we're partnering up with today. And that's a very exciting place to be, because I feel like we are seeing that shift. I'm just curious from your point of view, pulling away from the brand and looking at it from really the lens of an organization like FedUp Foods, who is deeply committed through our body of work of who we are, the decisions we make around social inputs, the decisions that we make around the environmental inputs, whether we're sourcing in different continents our products. How can we as an organization show up using that same approach, with technology?
A couple of thoughts. You touched first on the retailer, and the retailer is in a very difficult position right now, because in their own right as a brand, they've got to be defensible in public, and they're looking to work with companies like yours that give them a story they can tell that's going to resonate with consumers. So you've got to be really clear about your story so that they can carve out that real estate for you, so that their brand feels resonant with folks out there. And at the same time, they're feeling, as you mentioned, this price pressure. I mean, the gouging that went on last year in terms of price, raising prices as compared to inflation and so on. It was on the front page of the New York Times and other things last week and the week before. There's a lot of historical kind of ill will towards business more broadly, but the hit that consumers took last year really hurt everyone, and there's a lot of resentment and anger around that as well. So there's the retailer sitting there in the middle trying to deal with these expectations. Coming back to FedUp Foods, you're in a good position because we've been lucky enough to do work with everyone from Patagonia to Tom's to Seventh Generation to Allbirds to a lot of the purpose leaders out there. And one of the things I've observed early in the day, a few years ago, but even more so today, is counterintuitively, the more you lean into the integrity of your intent and actions, the better positioned you are to succeed in the marketplace in the future. And let me explain why. Typically, you had to play the game. Sell it as best you can, say what people want to hear, move as much product however you could to serve the bottom line. Now consumers are so aware of the challenges we face They're so cynical or distrustful of marketing and business more broadly. They're so well informed as to what's going on that it's very hard to fool them outright or to fool them for too long before they'll call you out. And in fact, many consumers make it their job to call out brands these days. In which case, as the issues we're solving for, climate or otherwise, become more acute and real and present in people's lives, the greater pressure there's going to be on business to show up in authentic and substantive ways. Because no one's going to put up with the BS anymore. Because the issues we're solving for are as real as extreme weather outside the window or supply chains breaking down or God knows what. And so, counterintuitively, the more you lean into the authenticity and integrity of your environmental commitments, how you source your products and so on, the better positioned you are to succeed in the face of that higher order scrutiny. Does that make sense? But if you said that 5 years ago, you'd be like, oh, that's a bit naive, or good luck with that, or go and be an activist brand, or God knows what, you know, because you're just too good by half. Well, we're smart. We know how to play the market. We got this thing figured out. There's this tension between the past and the present right now, and it's getting more and more acute every day. These timelines we're working against in terms of our viability as a species and a planet are getting so acute that our tolerance for playing at solutions is diminishing. It's draining out of the marketplace. And at the same time, you've got regulatory pressure that I touched on before, CSRD and so on. You've got competitive pressure when other folks are doing it. And you've got stakeholder pressure, investors, employees, and so on and so on. You put all that together, and the marketplace is going to reward a brand that isn't looking at its competitors, isn't looking at how low the bar can be in terms of expectation, but is going to reward brands who say, actually, we're doing it because this is who we are. And we're going to hold ourselves to a higher standard because that is an authentic expression of who we are. And we're going to set a new benchmark for the industry because anything less than that is irresponsible, not only to our future, but to ourselves. And so what you're doing at FedUp Foods is in fact the smartest strategic play you can make to thrive in the future because the way the marketplace is changing even as we speak.
Yeah, so we've been really landing on this terminology called Blue Ocean, which it's a great book. We talked a little bit about it last time, but starting to really be part of our conversation that, you know, we want to be a blue ocean company, not a red ocean. And red ocean is where you're going after high volume, low cost, where blue ocean, you're focusing on IP or underserved market. And, you know, I get really excited when I hear like these organizations that have been deeply committed to being purpose driven. And last year when one of our big industry rags, BevNet, coined FedUp Foods as the Patagonia of the food industry, that told me that the work that we're doing as an organization was finally at a national level being seen for what we're doing. And I think that's super exciting, and it really ties into a lot what Simon's saying. All right, we come to a point where this is where we have a break a little bit, just a quick 5 minutes. I know a lot of people said coffee and liquids, but we break for 5 minutes and then we come back and just kind of open it up for all of you for a Q&A with Simon. So why don't we adjourn here in like 5 minutes.
Think of your typical nasty questions. Think of those ones that we're going to get in with this one.